Good day, everyone, or good evening if you're in the Philippines. Welcome to everyone who's joined us today for a discussion about mental health issues in sport. We have a couple of excellent guests with us today, and my outstanding co-host, Marla Butterworth. She's out in New Mexico, going to lead part of our discussion today. Our guests are Dr. Julie Partridge, professor and faculty athletics representative here at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Her research interests include the impact of social influence, that is, peers, parents, coaches, siblings, on psychosocial outcomes in sport and physical activity, as well as the effects of shame and embarrassment on physical activity performance. She teaches a number of classes there, and as I mentioned, she is the faculty athletics representative. So she is the faculty's liaison to the athletics world at the university and vice versa. She works both sides of that very well, as from my point of view. Our other guest is Mark Fleming, who's the national director for Scotland with Sports Chaplaincy United Kingdom. Mark has been a chaplain since back in 1998 and has served very capably. Today in Scotland, there are over 110 football clubs that have chaplains. So Sports Chaplaincy UK is doing a great job of serving the sporting community in the United Kingdom. And in particular, there in Scotland, Mark is doing a great job of leading that. He has an MA in sports chaplaincy and pastoral care from back in 2016. And he is very much the go-to guy in Sports Chaplaincy UK related to mental health issues in sport. These are our two guests. We're thrilled to have you. Julie, do you have any opening comments from your side?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored to be here. As Roger mentioned, I'm the faculty athletics rep at SIU, and my academic background is sport and exercise psychology. So this is obviously a topic that's very near and dear to me. And so I've been in this sort of world for closer to 25 years than I used to say 20, but I think I've got to bump it up now. And I feel like the discussion around mental health for athletes is very much at the highest level that I've seen it at. I think this is now a conversation that I would like to say everybody is aware of, but probably still not everybody. But I think that the stigma is being reduced in asking for help, understanding that these are issues that are important. So I'm very excited to talk about it today.
Brilliant. Mark, any introductory thoughts that you'd have, sir?
Yeah, I think we all agree that, coaching has come on a long way over the years, in the sense that, we used to only focus on technical sides of sport, tactical awareness, physical prowess and strength. And then we took a step up and we began to talk more around confidence issues and building sportsmen up so that they could believe they could achieve more. But I think we're now getting to the stage where the very best man management really reaches into the hearts of sportsmen and makes them feel valued as people, not just as players. And I think this is where we as chaplains really play into that. It's also where we need to have a good understanding as chaplains of what mental health is and how it impacts upon a sports person's performance, but also on their life out with the game, which is what we're obviously more concerned about.
Outstanding. Very good. Some things have come up through the Olympic Games and other situations in sport in the last year or two that have brought this more to the public's eye. But many of us who have been serving as character coaches or as sports chaplains, we've been aware of some of these issues. Whether we've had good handles about what to do about them is another matter entirely. And that's what we wanted to talk today with sports chaplains about. How do we equip ourselves to understand the issues and then serve wisely in them? I want to throw the ball over to my friend and colleague, Marla, to lead our discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Roger, for setting us up. Thank you, Julie and Mark, for being with us. Y'all mentioned that the world is talking about it, and Mark, that coaching's come a long way now, looking at the hearts and minds of athletes as people, not just as players. So with that in mind, what would both of you say are maybe the top 3 or 4 mental health issues that athletes and coaches are experiencing today? And then a follow-up on that is that in light of those, what do we need to be aware of in our roles as we look at those top 3 or 4 issues?
Well, I'll jump in and say that, the majority of the athletes that I see, of course, are college athletes. I do work with some that are outside of that range, but that's who I see primarily. And I think that the issues that I see there are largely reflective of what you would see in any college population, right? So I would say anxiety, depression, eating disorders, certainly for some sports, probably a bit more prevalent than others. And those are sort of, I would say, so there's some generalized issues related to that. If you start adding in some sport specific issues, which obviously those two can bleed over, but for example, like seeing an athlete who maybe has sustained an injury, I think you're going to see the likelihood of those, being compounded, right? So anxieties over the injury, what that means for them. And then of course, I think Mark hit on it very well, like the, how that impacts how they see themselves as an athlete and a person. And unfortunately, sometimes those two don't get separated very well. I think those are, for me, probably the top things that I can think of. So again, things that we would, and then one more. I would probably just call it a generalized substance abuse potentially. But again, sometimes those are issues that are going to pop up in response to something else if people are self-medicating, again, whether to come back from an injury or to cope with the issues that they're experiencing.
I would say personally, at the core of most mental health issues that we come across, it's identity. Given within professional sport, the dehumanization that happens towards sports people, both coaches and players, etc. But like if they're doing well, they're deified. And if they're not perceived to be doing well, they're demonized. And ultimately they're dehumanized because they're only rated and valued according to the performance and results that they produce. And that then often reflects back on them in the sense that they value themselves according to performance and results. And that means then that if they do suffer a serious injury, or if a new coach or manager comes on the scene and their face does not fit, if they're not, part of the manager's plans, how that impacts upon their identity. When they have to retire from the sport, how that impacts on their identity. And we often find that professional sports people, who they are is actually about what they do on that park. And when their identity is stripped, when they no longer wear that shirt representing that team, when they are thrown on the scrap heap, or when they're regarded as superfluous. And at that point, they often don't know who they are because all their identity's been wrapped up in being that sports person. All their personal value has been around their performance and results. And if they've nothing apart from that, that can have a massive impact on their mental well-being and can lead to depression and anxiety and so forth. So I feel myself for chaplains, one of the key drivers, one of our USPs as chaplains is that we are those people in sports clubs that see past the player and see the person and always give people their identity back, recognize them as people, not as in positions. And I think that's really important that we do that. And we have a number of different ways in which we do that. I think one of the key things is that, uniquely as chaplains, how we value people is so different to the way their sporting environment values them. So they're valued according to performance and results. But as chaplains, we bring in God's grace value system, where God does not value us according to our performance and results, but according to the measure of his love that he has for us, which is eternal, and the value that he places on us, the blood of his own son, Jesus. We seek to put that same value on the people that we work with. So come win, lose, draw, good performance, bad performance, they feel valued by us. And they feel that we're giving them an identity that goes beyond being a sports person. And that in turn can lead to wonderful conversations about Christ as a result.
Awesome, thank you. So what I think I'm hearing you both say is that there's root and fruit. Kind of the root of the issue is truly identity, and then the fruit that it ends up bearing in the life of an athlete or coach is that anxiety, depression, eating disorder, substance abuse. A lot of this identity being wrapped up in injury or career end, just things that mitigate their career, public perception, stuff like that. So how can we be aware of this in our roles? Mark, you spoke quite well to that, at a 30,000-foot view, just helping to help them understand their identity. Would either of you like to dig deeper down just into some practical X's and O's of things we can be aware of or do, say in our roles, both with those who might share our faith, but how about the athletes and coaches that don't as well?
Yeah, so this is a very nuts and bolts answer, but when I teach, sports psych classes, obviously I have people in there that are going into a lot of different fields. And one of the things that I really try to emphasize, and I would assume that probably most people on this call have this, but I really encourage people to have a well-developed list of people that they can make referrals to for whatever, because there is no worse feeling than having somebody finally kind of come to the understanding that they're asking for help and realize, so I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm not a counseling psychologist, my work is exclusively with sport performance, but obviously the conversations will sometimes go into that area. And so there is no worse feeling than realizing this person is asking for help and I'm not 100% sure where to send them or where to suggest that they go. So that to me has been really helpful for me to kind of examine for myself, what can I help with and what can I not help with? I can certainly be there for the person. I will take them to, wherever they need to go. I'll walk them over. I will call, I will do all of those things. But I think it's important to know if there's something that's outside of my scope of practice that I can point them in the direction that they need to go. In terms of kind of getting to that point, and again, I feel like I'm saying things that all of you on this call are very well aware of, but establishing a relationship with somebody and letting them know, to kind of go back to what Mark said, that you do care about them as a person, that this is not about any repercussions that they might think are going to happen if they seek help. And, I think that the attitude is changing in sport. But I think there is still a concern that a lot of athletes have, that they're going to be seen as a problem athlete, or that they're going to be seen as, whatever. But having somebody there who's on their side that, is telling them, I am here for you as a person, I think allows that conversation to happen much, much easier. So I think a lot of the things that I'm certain that all of you on here are doing, and being that person for athletes is a big part of it, that they feel like this person cares about me as a person, not just an athlete.
Absolutely. I totally agree with Julie. And I think it's important that we don't come across as amateur wannabe psychologists, and we do recognise our limits. But see, at the same time, as well as recognising your limits, we need to sometimes take responsibility for those limits, upskilling ourselves. And I really think that as chaplains, one of the things that we should be doing is learning a lot more about basic neuroscience, the basic workings of the human brain. There's a lot of material out there that can really upskill us, not so that we promote ourselves as mental health experts, but at least so that we have a good working knowledge of the brain and the various parts of the brain and how they react to situations of threat and perceived danger, etc. Because if you're able to give somebody a degree of understanding, in the sense that you know what's going on for them, but you know the inner workings of what is going on for them, then that also better equips you to know who to signpost them to. So one of the key things that we've done in Scotland, and I personally was involved in a suicide intervention some 6 years ago with a professional player. Now, thankfully, it was a successful intervention. Thankfully, I had quite a bit of life experience in the issues that had precipitated this player's attempt at suicide. So I kind of got off with it at that time, so to speak. But I decided after that I really wanted to find out a lot more about brain health, about mental health. And so I was upskilled in that area. I qualified through our National Health Service in mental health awareness and instruction. And as a result of that, began to be called upon to deliver training within the professional game within Scotland. But part of my contract with them, part of the agreement, was that in training people up within the game to have a basic understanding around mental health, that I would also include all of our club chaplains in that training. So they would have the same upskilling as other key members of a club. So over the last 5 years, I've trained up some 700 people working within Scottish football, or soccer as you would call it. Now a quarter of those would probably have been chaplains, but there's been doctors, physios, sports psychologists, a range of other people within club life. And I think because we as chaplains are saying, look, we realise this is an issue, and we realise that we don't want to be amateur do-gooders, but we do want to make sure that we do no harm, we don't make matters worse, that we don't offer advice that we're not qualified to give. But by the same token, we want to really upskill ourselves. We want to really be qualified in our function, providing assistance in terms of people's mental well-being. So I think there's two things to say there. One, don't take more responsibility than you ought to. Recognise your limits, but where you recognise limits, see opportunities for being upskilled.
Yes, sir. That's awesome. You guys both spoke to a team effort. Mark, mentioning several people that are part of the team there in the UK for you. And in the medical community, they speak about doing no further harm. I think that's a lot of what you both are speaking to as well. So one of the questions we had intended to ask you actually falls into this road you both are running down. I'll kind of pose two questions. Feel free to answer them both or one of them. But we wanted to ask, when do you need to recognize when you need to refer? How do you do that? Julie, you started speaking about the list, so you're ready to do that. But then also in terms of where do you go to learn more about mental health? Mark, you referenced a particular place that you went, but where can we go to learn more about mental health, the parts of the brain, and then to think beyond ourselves and sort of in terms of training the teams around us? Maybe we can take the lead on that.
Yeah, so I think it's probably going to be a slightly different answer for everybody, because your own areas, obviously, you have maybe expertise in some areas or more comfort with some levels of conversation than others. I guess I would say that, there are a lot, so this is going to sound like a vague answer maybe, but I think there are a lot of options for places to go depending on what it is that you want to learn more about. Right. So something that I kind of learned early on for myself was, and I mentioned like eating disorder issues. I was noticing that I was having people bringing up things that were pretty clear to me that there were some, if not maybe a full-blown eating disorder, there were some flags that needed to be explored. And so, yeah, I started reading, like literally sort of went on to, Google Scholar, and I started looking at information. I reached out to other colleagues that I knew had expertise in that, reached out to individuals who did have counseling backgrounds to say, what do you think is the best approach to this? There are a lot of sports psychology sort of resources that, again, even if you are not trained to handle it specifically, that can talk about ways to address issues so that you're not, that you're keeping people open to the idea of exploring further. So again, I feel like that sounds like a vague answer, but I think everybody's issue might be slightly different. But I think recognizing like, okay, I'm comfortable with this part, or I know exactly who I would go to for this issue. I'm a little less certain what I would do in this situation, or who I would talk to. And I think constantly sort of updating that, hearing from, I guess the other thing would be making sure that we're checking back in with the people that we are talking to. If they're seeking help from someone else, obviously that that's likely going to be a privileged conversation, but just checking in to see, hey, is everything going okay? Is it working out well with that person? You know, I think those things, again, help athletes to feel like there is a team of people with them. There are people that are paying attention to what's happening with them and are trying to create like an entire safety net for them and their mental health.
Yeah, I can only back up what Julie said. For myself, I've surrounded myself with people that I would consider to be clinical experts in various fields. So from psychiatry, psychology, neurology, and I'm continually asking them, I'm continually finding out what they do, what they offer, so that I know what I'm suggesting might be helpful for somebody. So I think the very least we can do, for example, is make ourselves fully aware of, well, what happens in cognitive behavioral therapy? How does it work? That doesn't make me a CBT therapist, but I know exactly how it's done. You know, what is EMDR? Eye movement desensitization reprocessing. What is it? Because at least if I know what it is, I know that it's not for me to say that's what somebody should get. But, you know, if they come back to me and say this has been offered, what do I think? Well, at least I know what they're talking about. So I think it's just educating yourself on what various therapies are available, what it might look like, and it's checking in with somebody as they access support to see whether or not, in fact, this is the right fit for them, because one man's meat is another man's poison. And, you know, it's not a one size fits all when it comes to support and mental well-being. So I think for me as a chaplain, what I would be doing is joining somebody on the journey to recovery, but not taking responsibility for them getting across the finishing line, but just ensuring they've got to the starting point, and just checking in with them on the journey. So again, it's just making yourself aware, being educated, being aware of what resources are available to them, and building up a library of contacts and connections of people that you trust, that you can signpost towards.
Yeah, I'm going to add one other thing, that what Mark said just reminded me of this, that in the last probably year and a half, I had my sort of referral list, but I've actually started adding a lot more. I've reached out to colleagues and tried to make it as diverse as possible, because I would say that a lot of my initial things were, I was not taking into account diversity very well at all. And I really had to, realize that I was not doing a good job of putting that together. But I've included podcasts, I've included, popular books that are probably, I would say, maybe more clinical in nature. I've got, here's an interview from somebody that was whatever. I've tried to kind of create something that's not just a referral sheet, but something that I can constantly update to point people to, if they're just kind of interested in it. If I have an athlete that's like, do you have any podcasts that you listen to or whatever? And so I've tried to update all of those things, because it's going to maybe reach people in a different way for some people that are just kind of curious, versus here is a referral that I'm making to see a specialist in this area. So I've really tried to expand that out a bit better than it was before.
I would have to say, in Scotland, we historically have tended to take more of a biomedical approach in terms of recovery from mental illness. And we're now beginning to realise that there's a lot more support potentially available. And it's not just taking a look at things from a biological perspective, but there's a psychological, a sociological, a spiritual perspective. And all these things tend to kind of intertwine as well. So yeah, totally agree, Julie. I think there's lots of potential things, and it's not a one size fits all that we need to be looking at. I mean, for me personally, I'm every day is a school day. I am trying to learn something new every day, from reputable sources, obviously. So two people that I've found immensely informative and inspiring are, and I don't know if you've heard of these folks, Julie, be interested in your viewpoint, but Dr. Daniel Ammon, have you come across any of his stuff?
Familiar with, yeah.
Yeah, I'm loving his stuff, because he tends to obviously talk a lot about SPECT, brain scan technology, in terms of understanding what's physically happening in the brain, to be able to give an accurate diagnosis rather than simply identifying symptom clusters and making a guess at things, which is often the case. So I love his stuff, and I found that really helpful in terms of understanding the working of the brain. And also Dr. Caroline Leaf, who I'm sure you've heard of as well, who, again, a lot of her stuff, you know, is, some of it's a little bit over my head, and that's okay. But some of it, I'm like, yep, that makes sense. So just even upskilling myself, just as you were saying, Julie, and what's good out there to listen to, what people can listen to that won't completely lose them in the first 10 seconds, but they can actually make sense of it from a layman's background.
Yeah, thank you both for those answers. If we can, Roger, we can get some of these resources from them and provide them in show notes for folks. But Roger, you had a follow-on question? Go for it.
Yeah, across my 27 years of serving teams at the university, I can recall two situations where a young man talked to me about, or a coach approached me about a player thinking about suicide. And obviously I hurried to tell them, let's make sure we're talking to a counselor and all that. And so my first instinct was to stay out of the way almost. Then I thought, no, I need to maintain the relationship. This is what I can bring to the process is, I love the kid and I want to care for him and all that. But there is a sense, I think, probably a hesitance in some of us to, I just better back off and stay out of the way. Could you two speak to the collaboration that we can have of, I'm not going to pretend to be a psychologist. I'm not going to pretend to be a counselor, but I can genuinely care for the person while he or she is seeing that person. Is that, can you speak to that, please?
Yeah. So one thing that I think I don't know if I would say struggled with, but so again, my degree is, my PhD is in sports psych. So sometimes coaches are the ones who are like, oh, well, you're a sports psychologist. I'm like, I'm not a psychologist. I have a sports psychology PhD, but I'm not licensed as a counseling or clinical psychologist. And so I feel like I have to sometimes educate them about, this is what my scope of practice is. This is what I can help with. This is what I'm not okay helping with, or that I'm not, trained to help with. But I am part of the group of people if if that's something that can happen. So again, I think I try to keep the focus on, if the athlete, if I feel like I can be part of that. I certainly work with plenty of athletes who are seeing a counselor for, maybe generalized anxiety or depression or something like that. And I always make sure to ask, you're going to your appointments and, kind of checking in to make sure that that is all happening. And I let them certainly talk about things. If they want to say something, I'm not going to shut it down immediately as if we can't have any conversation. But I do make sure that they, say, now I hope you're talking to your counselor about that. And again, I really think it's about making sure that everyone knows this is what my area is. And so I've started making that even more explicit when I meet with athletes for the first time. And again, my experiences are sort of blended in many ways, because I have a lot of these students in class. A lot of them are majors that I see in a classroom. Some of them then I meet one-on-one. They know me as the faculty rep. So I have a lot of roles, and I've really tried to do a better job of sort of delineating what my role is in each of those. But it's really, honestly, a lot of times an education process for other people. So again, coaches, athletic trainers, that type of thing for me, Yeah.
I think playing into that as well is the importance of having really good listening skills, giving somebody a safe place to tell their story. Because very often people that I've worked with who have perhaps had a mental health struggle, I'm not so much asking the question, what's wrong with you? I'm asking the question, what happened to you? I think the more trauma-informed we can be in our approach to people, the better. And I've often found that simply being a safe person for somebody to speak to openly without a fear of being judged, rejected, gossiped about, corrected, or whatever, that can be very cathartic for somebody, and also informs me as to where I think perhaps I'm best signposting them. So be a great listener, listen with empathy, not to solve or fix their problems, but just to give them an opportunity to feel they're being heard, because you'll hardly do anything for anybody to make them feel more loved than just to listen to them with a truly empathic and compassionate heart.
I cannot agree more. I just want to put a little pin on that as well, to say, yeah, I feel like again, when I meet with people, it's usually, in a room that it does look, much more like a counseling sort of setting. And the sort of look of relief that I see so many times when I say, this is just a conversation between us. I don't talk to your coaches about what we talk about, anything like that. Sometimes it's just nice to have somebody listen who's not your coach or your teammate, and you can kind of say whatever you need to get off your chest. You can sometimes just see the relief on their face and sometimes I'll see somebody one time, they literally just want to get something off their chest. And then they go out the door. But yeah, just being a good listener and being empathetic and, understanding that they're coming to you with something is, I think, a huge, huge piece.
Yeah, thank y'all. Listening, empathy, trauma-informed care, being able to help them know what role you're playing. If you refer them, now you get to be their cheerleader, but that doesn't mean that you quit being a part of the team that keeps listening, keeps empathizing. So in light of that, because almost all the people on this call are chaplains or character coaches, work in some form of ministry, how would y'all advise us? How can you disciple somebody who is in ongoing counseling in a synergistic way, a way that works alongside their counseling? Particularly, Mark, I want to drill down on that. You mentioned trauma-informed care. Some people are going through ongoing counseling for profound traumas they may have even experienced in childhood that shaped the rest of their life to this point. It could be a recent trauma. We could talk about existential trauma of racism and social justice. We could talk about the little t trauma or big T trauma that COVID might have hit anybody on. But if people who, just double back to the question, make it succinct for you. How do we disciple somebody who's in ongoing counseling in a synergistic way?
I think you begin always by asking open questions, and reflecting back to them what they're saying to you, so that whatever's happening in that counselling session, for me, it's really important that they're able to grab a hold of it and own it and understand it for themselves. And one of the ways that we can help facilitate that is giving them a safe space to talk through, what they're finding helpful from the counselling session, what seems to be coming out of it for them. So that would be one thing, is asking open questions without being intrusive and interfering and nosy, but just asking how they're finding they're being helped and what difference is it making to them, and just giving them again a place to almost reiterate and confirm what's coming out of that counselling session.
Anything you'd have to add to that, Julie?
I would say I'm going to echo again what Mark is saying here. Yeah, for me, of course, it's my approach is more on the secular side, but I do think, again, sort of being there to ask if things are going well. I would say is another thing that I do try to make sure that, is it a good fit with the person that you're seeing? I do think sometimes, people, when they finally kind of get to the place where they're like, okay, I'm going to go see somebody, it can be hard to restart that process if it's not going well. But encouraging them to, like, is this something that you think is helpful? Do you want to see if there's somebody else, like giving them, again, the space to maybe say, if it's going well, great. But if it's like, I don't think it's really helping, trying to maybe figure out if another provider or another person might be more helpful, so that they don't just sort of drop out of the process, but find somebody that maybe fits better. And again, being there to help with that, I think is an important one, that they have somebody that they can kind of go back to, or that is sort of an anchor, really, for lack of a better term, that they can kind of go back to. And you can maybe be part of the process to help them find, if it's not if they're talking with somebody that it just doesn't match up well, that doesn't mean that it doesn't work. We just need to find maybe a better match.
Absolutely. And also, you know, for example, if they've been placed in antidepressant medication, for example, I would always be checking in with them the first 2 weeks, because it takes that long for it to kick in, and just check that they're aware of potential side effects. Ask if they're having any side effects, you know, and just checking if they're aware of that. And also from that 2-week period, just again checking in with them. How, you know, how's that affecting you? Feeling you're getting into a bit of a flow now, and it's kind of normalizing your situation. It's proving helpful, because sometimes what I've experienced is that somebody has, for example, been put on medication. It's led to horrendous side effects. The first 2 weeks they felt even worse than they felt before, but they think this was the last chance saloon. They think, if this doesn't work, nothing will, and they actually spiral into deeper despair. So I think just journeying with them. I keep using that word, but journey with them. It doesn't mean to say that you're driving the car. It just means that you're in the passenger seat with them, and just checking in that, you know, that they feel as if they're going the right direction for them.
Yeah, Mark, you used the metaphor that was in my mind of us being the passenger, them being the driver. I just want to share one thing and ask for your reflection on it, in light of, do you have any specific do's or don'ts that you would say in terms of discipling somebody who is seeing ongoing counselor? I've heard it said that sometimes as ministers, we like to be real quick to quote the Bible to somebody, say the Bible says this about your situation, or to even say, well, let me pray with you, and then start praying with them, for them right there, which is not wrong. But if somebody is dealing with deep trauma, particularly from childhood, they might be dealing with where was God when this happened? Where is God in all this? And could we actually, back to that do no further harm, could we actually be doing some harm there? Do you guys have anything to speak to that?
Yep, I think I'll speak first. Only answer the questions that they're asking. Leave aside your agenda. You know, only ask the questions they're asking is the main bit of advice I would give on that. Over to you, Julie.
No, I'm going to agree with what you just said. Yeah. I think it's very important to be answering whatever the question is that they are asking you. And I think that's always a challenge, right? When you're working with people, that it's a challenge not to come in and think, oh, let me tell you though what I think is going on, or let me tell you how to help. Because I think I would assume that everybody on this call wants to help. Obviously, that's a big part of it, right? So I think it's really hard sometimes to not be like, oh, let me tell you, but you know, letting them just have the space to talk about it, and really listening to what it is that they're asking for, or what they might need from you in that moment. I think it's a skill, and it's hard to sometimes not jump in with something else, but I think working on that. Yeah.
And also not saying, well, this worked for me, so it will work for you.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
Very true. Well, we've got about 5 more minutes here of time to ask you all before we open it up for Q&A. Are there any further do's or don'ts that this has triggered in either of your minds that you would give us in terms of like practical skills or tools? And if not, I've got a follow-on question unrelated, okay. But wanted to give a chance for that.
I can't think of additional ones right now. I'll think of one 2 minutes after we get off this call, but I can't right now. So I'll keep thinking.
I think the only thing I would say for me is that my background was in pastoring, you know, a church, as well as being a chaplain before I moved into mental health work, and still involved in pastoral work. But for me as a pastor in the past, I would have pretty much seen people as two-dimensional. I would have recognized their physical health and their spiritual health, and not really much in between. So if something was presented as a physical issue, then obviously you would expect go to the doctor, you know, get an operation, get medication. You'd certainly pray for physical healing. But if anything was out with that, the bounds of physical illness or injury, I would have seen it as a spiritual issue. and I would have automatically gone down the route of prayer, even deliverance, and really making it a spiritual issue. Now that I understand a lot more about how we are actually designed by God, body, soul, and spirit, and recognizing the psychological dynamics of us as human beings and how the brain functions, I think I would be very slow to assume something spiritual in somebody's challenge than I would have been in the past. Not that I am suggesting that might not be the case. I think there's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do think we need to see people as three-dimensional, body, soul, and spirit, and not make assumptions based on our experience. I would maybe just counter with that.
Yes, sir. Not making an excuse or assumptions. I appreciate that. So one final question before we go into Q&A. COVID, that's been a thing lately that has impacted mental health. Any comments on that as pertains to how we can help people of sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, I think it's really hard to overestimate exactly how much impact it has had, continues to have, will continue to have. So I think the primary thing that I think of first, again, because I tend to see college athletes, is that transition that happens right when they start college is hard. It's hard for everybody. You add in an athletic component, and then you add in on top of that at least here and several other places from colleagues that I've talked to, the isolation that has happened either because of, social, opportunities not being present or literally being quarantined. I know we've had some athletes that were quarantined for, 35 days last year. And you just think, I wouldn't handle that well. And I have lived here for, I know where to, anyway, it's just that isolation. I cannot fathom how that has impacted people. The disruption for many people, their sport is their place that they feel the best or they feel the most comfortable. And now you've placed all of these, there are all of these COVID factors that have sort of intruded into that. I would say here, this all obviously coincided with a lot of social justice issues that were all happening then at the same time. I just think it was like a really, really traumatic experience for many people. That doesn't even then talk about people who had family members affected, who had family members who passed away, who are still dealing with that. And there's still uncertainty sort of surrounding it. I just don't think we can overstate enough how much impact it is having on mental health in all directions, most likely.
Yeah, for sure. It's the same here. I think, we talk about loss, associating that with bereavement, but actually when you lose anything significant or which has a big impact in your life, that leads to a big change in your life that you wouldn't have chosen, these can all cause a great deal of grief. And there's been so much loss throughout the pandemic, just as Julie was saying there, the loss of community, the loss of purpose, the loss of focus, the loss of function, not to speak of the loss of life. So there's all these things. But I think there's another element to this that Julie touched on as well, and it's the fact that people's, fairly regular, dependable lives have been so utterly disrupted that certainty has just departed for so many people. And alongside grief and loss, often is connected anxiety, which is a worry of the consequences of that loss and a worry that there will be further loss, and that things that we thought were fairly, certain and dependable are now no longer. And, so how we found this really affected us in Scotland, for example, is that, the very essence of professional sport is the importance of having supporters, being at games, and the cash flow that produces as well. And so the financial uncertainties as a result of lockdown and no supporters, the isolation as well, the fact that, contracts are no longer assured, which they would have been under a previous financial climate. None of us know whether we'll finish the season off in any given sport because of a potential lockdown. So I would say that the overriding issue now, as well as grief and loss, is anxiety of what next. If that's all it took to ground us all to a halt, what next? And I think that's one of the areas that's hard to speak into in some respects, because we can't give guarantees. But we certainly need to understand what it must be like for people in terms of how the pandemic's affecting them. So yeah, I would say anxiety is a really key one just now. What next?
Yeah, I would add, I'm sorry, one other thing I think I would say that probably has affected everybody as well is just connecting with athletes has been different. Now with vaccinations, there's some, and practices are whatever, but, having to meet with people over Zoom, of course, it was difficult at times to make as what felt like as solid of a connection to me. Some student athletes didn't want to do Zoom anymore, which I fully understood, but then you're talking just on the phone. It was hard to read body language sometimes or see how people were responding to things. Couldn't go to practice to just see how they were doing. And some of those things that I think, again, from this side were difficult as well. And for the student or for the athletes as well, that connection. And then, as Mark said, that just the anxiety, I think, was just overwhelming for so many things.
Yeah, ultimately, it's the need for human connection. Back to the listening and empathy, you guys, right? Mm-hmm. That's that we're damaged in relationships or healed in relationships. So whether we're talking about COVID, which was the specific question, or other things that have been of loss and grief, worldwide, of course, coming at this from an American lens, a U.S. lens, but some of the social justice, the racial inequality things, I know that's around the world, even just the headlines in the news this week. People with a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions, a lot of access to news, wondering, what can I do to make a difference? What's wrong with this world? That kind of stuff, loss and grief. It's all there. It's not just COVID. So all informing mental health. So as we go to our questions, I know we have one in the chat. I don't know if anybody has any Q&A they want to bring. Let me. Sorry, the one here that we had already was, would you please speak to the dynamic of interacting with the team coaches about the student athletes counseling or your own conversations with them?
Yeah, so for me, again, when I talk to a student athlete, sometimes they come to me and the coach does not know that they're coming to me. They say, my coach doesn't know I'm here. Okay. And again, if I am concerned that person might hurt themselves or somebody else, obviously, then that's a different issue. But if we're just talking about, I'm in the middle of a slump, I don't really want to tell my coach about whatever, then when the coaches know that like they've sent somebody to me, I have to be very intentional at times about making sure that the coach knows that my conversations with that person are my conversations with that person. Coaches like to know everything, and I get that, but I try to make sure that they understand that I tell my people that I work with that when we go into that room, it's a little miniature Vegas. So what happens in there stays in there, and they don't need to worry about me going to tell the coach anything about what's going on. I sometimes counsel teammates, like they may or may not know that I'm meeting with a teammate. And sometimes they complain about each other. Like they'll say, this person is doing this, that person tells me the same thing. And, it's good. I think if the coach knows, then I don't hide it from them, but I don't seek it out. And that's part of, I think, that trust process, right? For them to know I'm not going to tell anybody about this. I also let them know, you may see me in the athletic department. You may see me talking to your coaches because I'm over there a fair amount, but I'm not over there telling them something that you've said. With these exceptions, these are things that we are just talking about in here. Sometimes coaches don't like that, but.
So would you say the exceptions generally boil down to harm to self, harm to others?
Yes.
Just to be clear for everyone listening.
Yeah.
So again, just completely always telling your, explaining your role and your value. Again, same thing.
Yeah.
All right, unless you have something to add, Mark, we've got another question in the chat.
No, I totally agree with everything Julie said there. So next question.
All right, what are some signs or red flags that athletes may exhibit while dealing with mental health? How can we help coaches identify what these are?
I mean, I'll speak first on this perhaps and say that what we would find is, things like a marked decline in performance, which is out of character. So where normally they're very energized and enthusiastic, now they seem to be de-energized and demotivated, and it's out of character. It could be that they find it hard to take on board instructions from the coach, and they don't seem to be processing things very well. And they might really struggle accepting correction. So maybe they have a fit of anger in response to a coach's correction, or they might just burst into tears, and it's not something that would be typical of them. They may have things like inexplicable aches and pains, because very often poor mental health is manifest in our physiology and how we're feeling physically. It could be things like that. Normally they're quite socially interactive. Normally they're very ebullient and full of fun, and completely uncharacteristically they're now very withdrawn. They maybe just turn up in time for training and they shoot off as soon as training is finished. So anything around them that is out of character, unusual, and extreme. Maybe erratic behaviours, maybe in training they're throwing themselves into tackles, if not very possibly injuring a teammate in a practice session, but actually injuring themselves in the process, or certainly inviting recriminations. So maybe they're behaving in such a way as they're inflicting pain on others and looking to that to be reciprocated, which again is out of character. So these are all signs that I would be looking at, where they just lose the buzz of the sport, they lose the enjoyment of the sport, and it no longer seems to really matter to them. These, in my experience, are not signs somebody's simply fallen out of love with the sport. Usually they're falling out of love with themselves, and there's a mental health challenge potentially.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with all of that. Like looking for anything that's sort of changing, missing appointments with you. Like if you have an appointment set up with them and they miss it, obviously that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I always try to follow up to make sure. If they miss 2 in a row, I would definitely, consider that a big red flag. I like to ask people just sort of generally, because I really liked what Mark mentioned about sort of unspecified pain or unspecified, whatever. I like to ask people as well, how are you sleeping? Just as sort of an entry point for that's kind of a not, sometimes people get a little uncomfortable with, questions even about mental health specifically, but, how are you sleeping? I think is a nice entry point question to sort of how are you doing overall? And if people are like, oh, I can't sleep at all, or I've been sleeping like 12 hours a night or something, which most athletes probably can't do that because of, having to be up and be places, but, sleep disruptions, if they're talking about, things that they've just never talked about, again, missing appointments. And then certainly if that there was a trigger that happened, so certainly like an injury did occur, they've been replaced or they aren't starting now, or, some of those types of things, I think that's where you'd really want to maybe just keep an eye on some of that type of thing.
Very good. We're going to turn toward home here, but I want to ask my friend Gerard down in Trinidad. You have a question, sir. You could unmute yourself and ask your question, Gerard.
Okay. Thank you, Roger.
Mm-hmm.
This is a question, an HR question. But before I give my question, before I submit my question, I just want to say I'm a big Glasgow Rangers fan. Mark, okay, not Glasgow Celtic, Rangers. Okay. Yeah. So what do you think would be the future, seeing that we live in such a VUCA world, and as a sports chaplain, and even Julie could chime in on this. What do you think is the future with regard, especially to professional sport, where just like how, especially with track and field athletes, they would have a team of persons around them, strength and conditioning coach, physiotherapists, their coaches, and so on. Do you see the inclusion of a traumatologist, a mental health professional being part of that team, and now, or especially as given the times that we live in pandemic et al, what do you see as the future for professional athletes and even college athletes?
Well, first of all, Gerard, regarding Glasgow Rangers, I assume this is because of Marvin Andrews.
Yes, definitely, and Russell Latipi.
Yes, I thought that. So Marvin's a good friend of mine. So I'll forgive you the Rangers connection for Marvin's sake. But interestingly, Glasgow Rangers, who I actually work with in delivering mental health training, they have a mental health nurse now at their academy. So yes, without a doubt, there is an increasing need, I think, for mental health support. But whilst it's important to have potentially a mental health professional, whether that is a clinical psychologist or a mental health nurse, I think it's also equally important to have people in the club who are trained to be bridges to that professional support. Because a while ago, they kind of talked about the possibility of having a mental health first aid officer at every English Premiership club. Mm-hmm. So you would have a room where the doctor would be, a room where the physio would be, and a room where the mental health first aid officer would be. And I thought to myself, I don't see many players knocking that door, because of the stigma around it. And so I think it's helpful to have people around the sporting environment who are upskilled in spotting the signs and symptoms of diminishing mental health, and then to be able to direct them and signpost them to the appropriate mental health support that's there. So whilst to say, yes, I think there is definitely moving forward, more going to be in the area of mental health support provision, I don't think that lets any of us off the hook. I think all of us also should take responsibility to upskill in this whole subject, so that we know to recognise things are not well, to sensitively and sensibly and appropriately approach somebody, and therefore to signpost them to what might possibly be the best way forward for them. So yeah, I think there's room for all of us in that regard.
Yep, I agree. I think there is seems to be like the growth in the number of people that are either sports psychologists, mental health professionals, whatever, that work with professional teams, et cetera. It has grown exponentially in the last few years. And I do not think that will change with the conversation that's happened, continues to happen. But, some of obviously what happened at the Olympics and those discussions, professional athletes continuing to come out and, acknowledge that they have seen somebody or sought out help or those types of things. I think it will continue, yes, to grow. And I think there is room for a lot of individuals to be part of that team.
Yeah. And one other thing that, I think for Gerard would be helpful to know is that Rangers have just drawn 0-0 in their game in Armenia, and that means they're through to the next round, Gerard.
Wow. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap things up today. I want to say thank you so much to Mark Fleming for making time for us from Scotland today, and for Dr. Partridge here in Carbondale. It's great to see you. I can almost see your office out my window here. You're just across town. It's been fun to have you all. I want to share my screen real quickly and have everybody see what's coming in the next couple of months. There are going to be a couple of new things happening here. On October 7th, we're going to talk about taking care of yourself. It's one thing for us to see that, yeah, we're going to make sure that we care for the players, the coaches, everybody in the sporting world with whom we're attached, but how do we take care of ourselves? I've had some conversations with sports chaplains and character coaches, and that same isolation that was a plague to players has also affected us, and some of us very profoundly. And so we need to figure out, how do we care for ourselves in the middle of this? That's what we'll discuss on October 7. And then coming up on November 4, we'll talk about managing time and priorities. Our lives go fast at times. And how do we juggle all the roles and the responsibilities that we have, and to treat each of them wisely and well? And so that's what we'll be talking about November 4. We have a number of other issues that will come up month to month. You can expect these Zoom meetings will happen the first Thursday of each month, this one being the exception just because of timing, but we'll aim for the first Thursday of each month, 11 a.m. Central Time here in the US. Terribly inconvenient for my friends in the Philippines, but we're very thrilled to have you be a part of it. I will post this recording, and so you can share it with friends that you like, anyone who wants to consume it on demand. Thanks once again, Dr. Partridge. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Marla. And thanks everyone who participated today.
Yes, and real quick, so everyone knows, we're also going to work on making it podcast available in bits. So more to come on that for you as well.
And Roger, I was just going to say, if you want to share my email address, feel free. If anybody has questions that I can answer at all, I'm more than happy to do that.
Outstanding. Mark's as well. If you want to get that, email me at rlipe@nationsofcoaches.com. rlipe@nationsofcoaches.com. Thanks, everyone. Bless you. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well done.